All right, so welcome back, everybody. So again, just a reminder where we were. We talked about definitions, basic definitions of cluster algebras. Then we talked about this big class of cluster algebras from surfaces. And today I want to talk about another class, which is pretty big and is still kind of an active area of research, is these cluster algebras coming from Grassmannians. And there's what should I say? So they're another big class of examples, and they have very interesting but different combinatorics that is involved in that construction. Okay, so the plan for today is I want to talk about Grassmannians, then I want to talk about their combinatorics, which comes from something called playback graphs. And then in type A, this is kind of the intersection. So type A, type AN, this finite type. It is a surface type, so this comes from triangulations of a disk, but it is also a Grassmannian type. So this is kind of where the two worlds intersect. And I'll briefly mention that as well. Okay, so this is kind of a reminder slide on cluster algebras, because I also want to define one more thing. So Q is a quiver on vertices 1 through n. And then the cluster algebra A sub Q is lives inside the field of Laurent polynomials. It is generated by these cluster variables that we all know is computed recursively from the initial seed. Okay, so the idea is once you know the initial seed, you know the cluster algebra. So a lot of the times in what we've seen before, this initial seed is some arbitrary collection of cluster variables, x1 through xn, some variables. But as I mentioned, somebody asked is, well, they don't have to be these x1, xn. They can be something more concrete or something like they can have some more meaning. As long as there's some independent, algebraically independent set of variables, I can run the procedure. Okay, so today, these will not really be x1, xn. They will have some more meaning to them. And so the idea is once you know the initial seed, you can generate the cluster algebra. So the goal for today is to understand the initial seeds for this cluster algebra, because it's not as sort of trivial. It's not as explicit. And now for today, it will also be important that so given a quiver Q, I'm going to designate some subset of vertices as being mutable. So meaning these are the ones that I'm allowed to mutate, and the others as being frozen. So these are sort of forbid mutation that. So that's the two terms I want to tell you. And so these frozen vertices, the associated variables you will never mutate at these initial variables associated to these frozen variables. And so these frozen variables, they would appear in every single seed. You cannot mutate them away. And so they're just always there. And the rest you can mutate. And so, for example, okay, you can, let's say, look at this quiver Q. And again, these three vertices, I'm just going to designate this vertex labeled 3 as being frozen. And usually one denotes frozen vertices by boxed vertices. And then the point is that the cluster algebra associated to this quiver really has the same combinatorics and the same structure as just removing the frozen vertex. So it's kind of the same as just looking at the smaller quiver from 1 to 2. And the idea behind this frozen vertices is they carry some further information. In particular, it will be important for the case of Grassmannians because they have some other meaning. That's why they're here. All right.
Excuse me.
Mm-hmm.
When you say so that AQ has the same combinatorics as A1, 2, so you mean here that like, well, but if the vertex is frozen, its cluster variables still in the algebra, yeah?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes,
okay,
cluster variable is still in the algebra, but actually if you set the frozens to be 1, if you let them be 1, then you recover the other cluster of algebra. So they're kind of there, they have some information, but the number of seeds, the type of the cluster algebra, the number of quivers and so on kind of remains the same. Okay, you can't really.
Okay, thank you.
All right, so let's talk about the Grassmannian. Okay, so what is a Grassmannian? So it's a geometric object that have appeared in the literature way before cluster algebras, and it was important and it was studied and so on. So it's kind of a classical thing. So Grassmannian, which I'm going to denote by GRKN, is by definition a set of k-dimensional linear subspaces of the C to the N. So it's some sort of C to the K subspace of C to the N, okay, linear algebra. Now the elements of the Grassmannian, then a convenient way to denote them is as a K by N matrices. So K rows and N columns, and in particular, then if I take the row span, so all the rows are here, and I look at the vector space generated by the rows, I get out a k-dimensional subspace of C to the N, which is an element of the Grassmannian. Okay, I take the matrix of full rank so that the row span actually has full rank, K rank, dimension K. Now, in this way, if you were to denote your elements of the Grassmannian, you would get a lot of duplicates because the same matrix, as you know, may have the same row span, but it would have different entries, but the row span would be the same. So it would give you different elements of the Grassmannian. So really the way to think about it, it's matrices up to an equivalence. So it's matrices, K by N matrices with entries in C, full rank. So that's kind of what my star means. Modulo action, so the action by GLK, so invertible K by K matrices on the left. And so what this does is it actually is just applying row operations to the matrix. And from linear algebra, possibly, as you know, row operations do not change the row span of the matrix. So this is all good. So that's kind of the way you want to think about elements of the Grassmannian. It's matrices up to row operations.
Excuse me. So this star, what the star means? Matrices without zero denominators.
Full rank. Oh, so yeah. I mean, determinants are not defined here. These are not square matrices.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So I'm sorry.
No, but the determinants will be on the next slide. Yes. Okay. Okay. So here come the determinants. They are important. So given I, okay, so this is my notation for I as an K element subset of the integers 1 through n. So K is an element subset of 1 through n. And then P sub I of A, this is called a Plucker coordinate. So A is my matrix. And P sub I, this is a maximal minor of the matrix A on the columns indexed by I. So remember, A is a K by N matrix. I picks out K columns, and they already have K entries in them by definition, because my A is K by N. So you are allowed to take the determinant of the submatrix of A. Okay, so it's a determinant of A on the columns indexed by I. I is a K element subset of 1 through n. So that's a function. And then there's something called the Plucker embedding, which, given an element of the Grassmannian, you can send A to the to all of its Plucker coordinates, okay, where you take all of the Plucker coordinates for every K element subset, and then things are well behaved such that in this way the Grassmannian can be identified with its image, and it makes Grassmannian into a projective variety. Okay, so it has some more nice structure. That's all I want. And then the idea is we can talk about the coordinate range of the Grassmannian. So it's not just a set, it has some geometry as well. And we can talk about the coordinate range of the Grassmannian. And so in particular, the elements of this coordinate range are functions on the Grassmannian. Okay, so elements here are functions such that you can apply them to these matrices and get out something. Okay, so it's elements of functions on the Grassmannian. And so that's the object we're going to talk about, this coordinate range of the Grassmannian. Okay, so it is again, this is something very classical, and it was studied before, and it is known that this coordinate range of the Grassmannian has the following structure. So it is generated by these Plucker coordinates, all of them, but these Plucker coordinates, they actually have relations between them. They are not independent variables at all. And so you have to mod out by something called Plucker relations. I'm not going to really talk about Plucker relations. We'll talk about only very particular ones, something called the short Plucker relations, because that's what comes up in cluster algebras. But these are not the only relations. There is a bigger set of relations here. Okay, so the coordinate range of the Grassmannian are just linear combinations of Pluka coordinates. Okay, so for example, if you sort of take the smallest non-trivial example, let's say Grassmannian 2, 4, then it would be generated by all the two element subsets of the set 1 through 4 Pluka coordinates. So 1, 2, 1, 3, 1, 4, 2, 3, 2, 4, 3, 4. And then the Pluka relations, in this case, there's just a single Pluka relation, and it's that the product of P1, 3 times P2, 4 is this P1, 2, 3, 4 plus 1, 4, and 2, 3. Okay, some relation. Don't have to remember it. But for example, you can look at a matrix A. Let's say A has this structure. Okay, it is indeed an element of GR. This should be 2, 4. 2, 4. Okay, we see it is a full rank, so it does give an element of GR2, 4. And so, for example, you want to check whether this relation is satisfied whenever you apply it to this matrix A. And so, again, just to make sure we're all on the same page, what is P1, 3? I take out columns 1 and 3 of this matrix, so I get 1, 0, and AC, that's this. And this, the Pluka coordinate just takes the determinant of that matrix. This is a 2 by 2 matrix. I can easily take the determinant is C in this case. P2, 4, I look at the columns 2 and 4, 2 and 4, that's 0, 1, BD. I take the determinant of that. The determinant is negative B, and so on. You do this on the other side as well. And you compute what the determinants are of these other 4 things. And okay, now you just want to check this. This evaluates to minus BC. And here you have AD minus BC minus AD. So you also get a negative BC as well. Okay, so the relation holds, everything good. These are the objects we are talking about. Pluka coordinates are just some maximal minors on the matrix, and they satisfy these some relations. Okay, questions here? Excellent.
So, excuse me, so Pluka relations holds for all elements of G2, 4?
Oh, so the Pluka relations hold for if you apply it to any element A of the Grassmannian. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, so here I picked a particular one, for example. I mean, it's still somewhat general. I have variables, but it is, yeah. All right. Okay, so then there was after the introduction of cluster algebras so these were introduced 2001. In 2006, Scott showed that the coordinate range of the Grassmannian is also a cluster algebra. So it has some more kind of combinatorics coming from the cluster algebra that sort of wasn't seen or wasn't even known before because they weren't there. And the nice thing about, well, now you want to know what is the structure of this cluster algebra, how I can understand it, what is happening. And we're going to go through that. But the nice thing is that, well, you have this set of cluster variables, and in general, it will be infinite. But you also have these nice Pluka coordinates, which are these elements of the Grassmannian, which we understand very well. And these actually form a very nice subset. This is certainly generally not inequality of the cluster variables. Okay, so Pluka coordinates, which is a finite set, they form a very nice subset of all the cluster variables for this Grassmannian case, but in general, there are many, many more. This is generally infinite. Okay, so in our example from before, I'm just going to tell you what the cluster structure is, and then we're actually going to talk about how one would find it, but just since we talked about the 2, 4 before. So this GR2, 4 example, it is actually has the following structure. It has 2 seeds, and this is a quiver for one seed, and this is the quiver for another seed, meaning that I have 5 vertices, 5 cluster variables in my initial seed, and this is the relation between them. That's the quiver you would associate to them, right? To every vertex, it's like you associate a cluster variable, and these are my cluster variables, are these Pluka coordinates in this case. All of these on the outside, this 1, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 1, 4, these are frozen. These are the boxed vertices. There's just a single mutable vertex here, P1, 3. Okay, so what can I do with this cluster algebra? If I mutate at this P1, 3, I get this new cluster variable P2, 4. So I mutate, right? I get some expression, some other Laurent polynomial. And so if you remember your mutation rule, it's the product of the things coming in. So P12 plus P34 plus the product of things coming out, P23 times P14 over the old variable P13. And now if you check this, the relation that I told you from before, it actually is, if you were to solve for P24, this would be precisely the exchange relation. So P24 is the new variable you would put here, and the rest are frozen. And since the mutation, remember, is an involution, if I mutate here, I would get back again. So this is it. This is a rank, this is a one mutable vertex cluster algebra. It has exactly just has two seeds, and this is it. And so then as a cluster algebra, you can think of it as being generated by these cluster variables, P12, P13, P14, P23, 24, and 34. Okay, that's, well, hold on. Yeah, I mean, these are all the cluster variables I did. Okay, this is the same line I did from before. Never mind. So modulo this relation, but this relation is now an exchange relation. Now, not all Pluker relations will be exchange relations, only these short ones that sort of just have three terms. These will be the exchange relations for the Plukers. Okay, so that's the structure in GR24. Now, how can one find it in general, and how does one arrive at this picture? Okay, that's our next sort of big thing. So now I want to talk about these objects called playback graph, because these are the things that give us the answer. Somehow the combinatorics is hidden here. It's very, very, very nice. And so these playback graphs, I think they first appeared in the work of, in relation to Grassmannians, in the work of Alex Postnikov. All right, so G is going to denote a playback graph. So a playback is just sort of a short term that people use, which stands for planar and bicolored. So planar, there are no crossings of the edges. Bicolored means that my vertices are colored in two colors, and these will be white or black. Okay, I have white and black vertices. I want my graph to be connected. And I want it to be drawn inside the disk. So this is kind of my black and white graph. I also have these edges going to the boundary. And since I want to embed it into a disk, I'm also going to draw a disk around, okay? Connected, edges going to the boundary, black and white vertices on the inside. These I don't give a color on the edge of the circle. The color will not be important there. Okay. Yes, good. Now, one consider these playback graphs up to something called moves, local moves, because I mean, you can imagine there's just so many things you can draw. There's so much freedom into this construction. Just draw a graph as black and white vertices, planar. Okay, there are lots and lots of possibilities. And so there's something one can do for these graphs, and that's called a local move. And so the first local move is as follows. This is called a square move. So whenever you have a square face where the vertices around the square, they alternate in color. So black, white, or white, black, white, black. And I really want this configuration where this vertex is trivalent, three things coming out, okay? It doesn't have other spikes. Okay, whenever you have such a configuration, you can change the color of the vertices. And this is called a square move. So this white become blacks and so on. So all of the colors have changed. This is called a square move. One can do remove a vertex of degree 2. So whenever you have such a vertex, so here I drew it as being white, but it could also be black. So whenever you have a vertex of degree 2, so just two edges coming out of it, you can remove it and it's not going to sort of affect the combinatorics we can be talking about. And then the last move is whenever you have an edge between two vertices of the same color, again, these are drawn both white, but they could as well have been both black. The important thing is that they're both of the same color. Once you have that, regardless of what comes afterwards, spikes, what you can do is you can contract this monochromatic edge and you just get a single white vertex with the same kind of connections. Okay, you contract the vertex. So these are the three local moves we will be talking about. Okay.
Excuse me. Can I ask you, so in a square configuration, each vertex must have degrees of 3, yeah?
Yes.
Thank
So
you.
actually, yeah, that's a good point. So whenever you see a square and it doesn't necessarily have a degree 3, you can do these other moves to make it a degree 3 square. You can make it to have this configuration.
I see. Okay, okay.
Question, Maxim?
Hello, am I right that 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 means that corresponding edges are connected on, I don't know, on some additional 6th virtual edge or
So I don't.
does it mean that, for example, white nodes are all connected here because of this circle around this, or
I don't really think of the circle as being sort of an edge of my graph. Okay, the circle here just gives me a way to also number these edges which go to the boundary in a, let's say, clockwise way, in my way. Okay, they're just sort of a nice visual tool. I don't really think of them as edges. I don't really think of them as really edges of the playback graph.
Just does it mean that it's connected, or I just got the things wrong, or I?
Oh, so okay, so I want my inside to really be, well, my inside doesn't have to be. Okay, so for the Grassmannian case, I do want, yeah, we were talking just about the Grassmannian. I do want this thing to be connected.
Oh.
Just the inside already to be connected. I can't have two disconnected pieces here. Yeah, so my circle is not used for connectivity.
Oh, thank you.
Yes. Okay, now it's sort of too much to ask because there are just so many playback graphs that all of them kind of work or you want. So you take this subclass of playback graphs, and these are called reduced. Okay, so a graph is said to be reduced if it cannot be transformed via these local moves to a graph containing the following configuration. So these configurations are sort of forbidden. A diagon. So here, a diagon is two vertices where I have an edge from one to the other as another edge from one to the other. And these can be of the same color or of different colors. It doesn't matter. The point is I do not like these diagons. So these diagons I don't like, and there's nothing on the inside. There's no more structure, sort of. This is it. This is the little piece, and there's still nothing on the inside. So these diagons we do not like. Or we also do not like these internal leaves. So an internal leaf is an edge between two different colored vertices, black and white or black. And this guy on that side, so it would go somewhere to the boundary. So there's nothing here. This is it. This is the vertex of degree 1. There's some stuff here, but the point is, yeah, since we are in the Grassmannian case, this is it. I don't like this configuration. There could be whatever stuff on the other side. Okay, so I don't like these degree 1 vertices of different color. And so, okay, so a priori, if I give you a graph, it is not so easy to say whether it is reduced or not, because it is up to local moves. So if I give you a graph G, just because it doesn't have these configurations, it doesn't mean that after I apply some local moves, I may not see such configurations. So it's not such an easy thing to see. There's an alternative way to define them, but I don't want to go in that direction. So take this for the statement of being reduced. So, and from now on, whenever I talk about playback graphs, we're always going to assume that these are reduced. We're only going to work on the reduced case. All right. Now, given this playback graph, we can associate a quiver to it, okay? So our goal is to go back to the cluster algebra. So we're going to want to go back and define all of these cluster algebra things for it. So my Q of G is going to know the quiver associated to this reduced playback graph G. And the assignments work as follows. It is very, very nice. So my faces of my graph G are going to correspond to vertices such that if I have an internal face, so internal face means it is not connected to the boundary, or it is not bounded by this disk that I drew. So internal vertices are going to correspond, internal faces are going to correspond to these mutable vertices, which I denote by these dots. And then boundary faces, faces which are adjacent to the boundary, I'm going to correspond to frozen vertices, which I'm going to denote by these squares. And whenever you have an edge between two different colored vertices, I'm going to draw an arrow, which let's say cuts across the edge such that I see the black vertex on the right and the white vertex on the left. That's my conventions. Okay, so in our example, this is going to be our running example for today. So I'm going to label, right, so I look at the quiver, and so I have these two internal faces, this pentagon, this square, and this pentagon. So I'm going to have two mutable vertices. On the outside here, these are my boundary faces. I'm going to have these square vertices, frozen vertices. And then whenever I have a edge between two different colored vertices, I'm going to draw an arrow which sees black on the right. So black on the right, black on the right, black on the right, and so on. And you see this is an edge, for example, between two vertices of the same color, and so I don't draw an arrow through it. Like these edges do not induce arrows. Okay, so that's a way to associate a quiver to such a playback graph. Question.
Are we allowing diagon where one edge is arc of a circle?
That would also not happen. No.
Okay.
Yeah, you wouldn't. Yeah. The point is, whenever, as I said, so these edges which connect to the boundary, they don't have either black or white. So whenever I write these are sort of the interior vertices. These edges, these things on the boundary, they are not colored black or white. They're just sort of to give me to see the boundary of the circle nicely.
No, I also mean, are we allowing, like, actually, as I understand, diagon prevent us from having a cycle of colored, like cycle of one color, right?
So this could be black or white, or these could be both black. The colors of the vertices does not matter.
Okay.
So they can be of different colors.
They could be as long. Yeah, the problem is I don't like digons. That's the thing. Digons are bad. Whatever color it is. Yes, I didn't draw it in the picture, but I mentioned it in words. Yeah, so they can be whatever color they want. I don't like digons. All right. Now we had this square move, and so nice question as well. How are these local moves? We had 3 local moves. How are these local moves affect the quiver that we drew, we just defined? And the correspondence is as follows. Whenever you have a square move, it actually corresponds to a quiver mutation. So that's really nice. Square moves means that the associated quivers get mutated at that vertex, while the other local moves, actually, they do not affect the quiver at all. So, okay, this is an example. One would have to check. In order to check that square moves the mutation, one may have to do more cases. But suppose this is my square configuration. And the quiver in this case would be as follows. So these would be some vertices. So these could be either mutable or frozen. That doesn't matter. And so this would be the configuration. And now if you were to do the square move, these edges now become monochromatic, so they don't induce any arrows, but you only have these arrows still coming from the square, but all arrows switch direction. And if you think about what happens when you do a quiver mutation at this vertex, you would look at all the paths of length 2 through this vertex. So you'd go here, here, which means you would add a new arrow going back from this vertex to that vertex. And under removing 2 cycles, it would cancel with this arrow. Okay, so things are sort of well behaved, and same would happen all around the other vertices as well. So this would be a mutation. If you think about what is removing a vertex of degree 1, let's say we're in this configuration, well, if these are all different, then that's right. These would induce a 2-cycle in the quiver, but then after removing this vertex, you would have no arrows. So actually, okay, one thing I should have said, in the previous construction of the quiver, you could have created 2 cycles. Q could have had 2 cycles, but then you would just remove them. Whenever you see them, you remove them. And so this is kind of the idea. These, if you have a 2-cycle here in the quiver, it looks like it's really there, but we are thinking of quivers up to 2 cycles. So removing this vertex is going to same as removing the 2-cycle. And then contracting a monochromatic edge has no effect at all because it doesn't induce any arrows. So that's easy to see. So maybe this requires a few more cases, but it's not hard to see that this is actually true. So square moves are mutations and the rest are just the quiver doesn't see it. Okay, now the thing you can do is, given a reduced playback graphs, you can associate a trip permutation. So trip permutation is just the permutation, so an element of the symmetric group. And so for here, it is important that you sort of start with a labeled graph. So you have a playback graph, and then I'm going to label the vertices in some way around the boundary. And let's say for today, we are doing clockwise orientation, and this is my vertex 1. I mean, so if you chose a different labeling, your trip permutation would be different. But you generally want to follow clockwise order or counterclockwise order. You have to pick one for the theory to work. All right, so what's a trip permutation? The trip permutation is a trip. So it's a path in my graph which starts at the boundary and ends at the boundary. So at the boundary meaning on the circle and ends at the circle, such that I follow the edges of my graph, and whenever I hit a white vertex, I'm going to turn maximally left, and whenever I hit a black vertex, I'm going to turn maximally right. Okay, so in my example, if I start at this boundary vertex, I'm going to follow the edges of the graph. So I go here, I hit a white vertex, and then I'm going to turn maximally left. So this would be left. Then I see a black vertex, I'm going to turn maximally right. I see a white vertex, I'm going to turn maximally left and left again, and I arrive at vertex 3. And so I now record this in my trip permutation. So this is a permutation in 2-line notation. And so it says that 1 is going to map to 3. So vertex 1 gives me a trip that ends at 3. So I'm going to go from 1 to 3. Similarly, if I were to start at 2, I would go here, hit a black vertex, turn right, turn left, turn right, left, and end at this 4. So my trips starting at 2 ends at 4, which means my trip permutation sends 2 to 4, and so on. You can keep doing this and you get some permutation in S5. Okay. And now there's a nice theorem of Pozniakov, is that these reduced playback graphs are move equivalent if and only if they have the same trip permutation. So that's really cool. So it's not hard to see that doing these local moves doesn't actually change the trip permutation. Okay, that's something you can check. But the converse is not so trivial to see, right? That any two playback graphs that have the same trip permutation can be obtained from one to another via a sequence of local moves. So that's certainly a non-trivial statement. But that's really nice. So all of my playback graphs with the same trip permutation are connected by local moves. Okay, questions here?
Yes, I have a question about the previous slide. So can we actually obtain all possible quivers from playback graphs with this operation?
No. So for example, already the quiver, since the graph is planar, the quivers you get would also be, for example, planar. But there are quivers that are non-planar.
I understand, thank you.
Mm-hmm. No, so these are sort of a nice subclass of quivers we get. And planarity is not the only restriction. Mm-hmm. Other question? Maxim?
Yeah, I've got a question. So can you repeat please how you form permutation pi? I understand why 1 going 3, 2 going 4. What about 5, 1 and 2?
So starting at, oh, so then I would start at vertex 3 and I would see where if I were to start at 3, where would the trip starting at 3? Yes. You have to do it for all the vertices.
Okay, I thought that you by some reason chose on the 1 and 2. Okay, I see. Okay, I see. Thank you so much.
So I'm gonna have 5 trips here. I just drew 2 of them.
Can you realize each permutation as some trip permutation?
Yes, that's a good question. Yes. Every permutation can appear as a trip permutation. Now you have to allow maybe for disconnected playback graphs for that to work. It's, yeah, but yes.
And actually, is it obvious that this is indeed a permutation? Like why 2 trips cannot end in 1 point?
Yeah, so 1 needs to be reduced in order for this to work. But yeah, it is not obvious. That is certainly not obvious, yeah. Good. All right. Now here's some more amazing combinatorics that happens with these trips and playback graphs. So this is quite a surprising result if you just think about the definition, what's happening. Now I'm going to label the faces of my graph as follows. So my faces of the playback graph are going to get labeled by subsets I, such that we have the following. So whenever you look at this strip, so you have this strip, such as one of the ones we drew on the previous slide, and suppose the trip ends at vertex I on the boundary. It starts somewhere, but it ends at I. Then all the faces, so this strip is going to subdivide sort of my playback graph into 2 pieces, something on the left and on the right of that trip. And so I'm going to label the faces on the left of the strip with I. So all the faces are going to contain I. And then I do it for all the trips and I get some subset of 1 through n. Okay, so for example, I have this was one of our trips. It was ending at 3. These are the 2 faces on the left of that trip. So all of them get a label 3. Okay, 3 is the one highlighted in orange. Now I do this for all the trips. So then, for example, I will do it for the blue trip, which ends at 4. These are all the faces to the left of the blue trip. So they also all get labeled 4. So in particular, this one then gets a label 3, 4. And then I have to do it for all the trips. And then all the faces get some sort of labels by some subset of 1 through n. Okay, makes sense? And now the miraculous thing is that after doing this, the face labels will all have the same cardinality. They always have the sets will always have the same size. So these are all 2 subsets of 1 through 5. These all have size 2. Okay, again, which is something really not obvious from this definition. So every face will be on the left of the same number of trips. And again, for this to work, you need reduced playback graphs.
Will they always have cardinality 2?
No. In this example, it's 2. Okay, so this example is going to correspond to GR2n, K is 2. That's why it's cardinality 2. But for more general playback graphs, you can have whatever cardinality you want. For Kn, you would have cardinality K. Right. Now, what is the sort of, yes?
I wanted to give a comment to one of the questions. Is every such like trip permutation is actually a permutation? I think that if you try to reverse the process, you always can reverse it, because you look at the color, like you just go back and you see it's black. So you can decide on which edge from black you have to go back, kind of.
Oh, but the idea
here,
is, how do you?
Well, I feel that I say that if we start at, for example, from 4, we want to find if I start at 4, yeah, like I'm going back. You see what I mean? Like 2 trip starts at 2 goes to 4. So if I try to reverse it, I go from 4 to the black vertex and think, or from which edge do they have to go. And you know that because it's black, then it has to be, in this case, which is going to the left, and so on, and you just repeat the process because you have our rule for turns. So I think you can just reverse the process, and therefore it is indeed a permutation. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it should work like this.
But
But it's not been obvious that it's bijection, right?
yes, that's
The
right.
question,
How do you
the
know
question was if
Oh
it's
yes, the question was
permutation.
that any two. Well, yeah, but
Like we need a
well,
bijection, but we need a bijection for permutation.
Yeah, how
and
do
we
you know
can
you're
say
gonna reach all the vertices?
okay, I see.
I mean,
I
but
see what you mean. Yeah.
Maxim proves that the endpoints of distinct,
yes,
if you
they
start at
will be
different points,
different.
you end in different points, and you have the same number of starts and ends, so it must be bijection.
Yeah.
And actually, what Maxim explains is basically the same rule, but you just inverse the coloring black to white and white to black. And I think that's the reverse process that Maxim is trying to explain.
Yeah. It's a good way of talking about it.
Okay, so one thing you would have to show is that kind of this process also stops, right? You're not running into some cycles. So you could start somewhere and then, well, you turn this black right, left, right, but then maybe you run into some cycles and then you ever stop. Okay, so that's something one would have to also show.
Yeah, I agree with you on this one.
Again, and so the fact that the graph is reduced, this is a very important restriction.
Okay.
All right, we have this face, we have the trip permutations, we have the face labeling of the same cardinality. Now, what is the property of these face labels that actually have a nice property? Again, something really not obvious and was another. So each of these statements was like a paper. They satisfy the following thing. So we say that two k-element subsets of 1 through n, I and j, are said to be weakly separated if there do not exist the following configuration. If there don't exist A and C in set I but not J, B and D in set J but not I, such that whenever you order A, B, C, D cyclically on a circle, so you think of this being kind of mod n, then we do not see this crossing. So I don't want to see B and D in set I but not, how do you say it? Yes, B and D are in set J, but not I. A and C are in set I, but not J. And so they are crossing here. So they are not weakly separated. So yeah, I don't want to see this crossing condition. So weakly separated would mean I would have a circle here. I would put things in I, but not J on this side. I would put things in J, but not I on the other side. And I'd kind of be able to separate them on the circle. And the things which are in both can kind of be sporadically around. But I would be able to separate I's from J's. Okay, so that's my weak separation condition. And then there is the following theorem by Pozniakov and Spire, which says the following, that the phase labels of a reduced playback graphs are pairwise weakly separated. So if I take two phase labels of a playback graph, and then they will satisfy these weak separation condition for every pair. And then conversely, the statement also holds that any pairwise weakly separated collection can be realized as phase labels of a reduced playback graph. So weak separation kind of captures completely these phase labels of a playback graph. Okay, so it's another equivalent characterization of phase labels of a playback graph. It's this weak separation, pairwise weak separation. Okay, and so again, what is our goal? Our goal was to understand this theorem by Scott, which says that coordinate range of the Grassmannian is a cluster algebra, where Pluka coordinates form a nice subset of cluster variables. And then the idea is you want to understand playback graphs, certain playback in terms of playback graphs. And now in order for this machinery to work, actually I need to restrict on the types of playback graphs I use, and it's quite a strong restriction. So you can ask me, what do all the other playback graphs which correspond to? And I can tell you that. But for Grassmannians, these are the playback graphs you want to take. So G has to be of type Kn. And by definition, what I mean is the associated trip permutation is very concrete. It's the trip permutation which sends an element I to an element I plus K. Okay, so these very restrictive class of playback graphs with these trip permutations, these are the ones we're going to consider for the Grassmannian cluster structure. And here's the big theorem, which is putting together a lot of the works, is the cluster structure on the coordinate range of the Grassmannian is as follows. So on this side, we have a reduced, so you start with the reduced playback graph G of type Kn. So this is important. I need to be of Kn in order to correspond to a seed in the Grassmannian Kn. Then these under an equivalence. So equivalence here is an equivalence which, so I say these two playback graphs are equivalent if they have the same face labels and can be obtained from one to the other via local moves. Then this gives me a seed, a particular seed in the cluster algebra. What is the seed? So the quiver of the seed is exactly the quiver of the playback graph that we saw, where the faces of the graph correspond to the vertices. And this is the cluster. These are the cluster variables. Well, what are the cluster variables? The cluster variables are precisely the Pluka coordinates P sub I, where I is one of the face labels of here. So whenever you see so you start with the playback graph, you label the faces, and then the faces, these are K element subsets, and then the associated cluster variable will have these Pluka coordinates as cluster variables, and the quiver as the associated quiver. Okay, and moreover, this is also in bijection with these pairwise weakly separated collections from the previous theorem, but now in order to be of type Kn, these are maximal pairwise weakly separated collections. So that's a maximal set of these pairwise weakly separated collections, and these are all in bijection. So what does this do? It tells us, well, if I now have a complete understanding of the seeds in my Grassmannian cluster algebra, where every cluster variable is a Pluka coordinate. So if you have seed that consists completely of Pluka coordinates, then it comes from a playback graph. Okay, so we don't just have a single seed, we don't just have an initial seed to start with, we actually have a whole sort of class of seeds which are nice and we understand very well. So in particular, it gives you an initial seed, but also many more. So, okay, so more concretely, in our running example, I started with a playback graph. I labeled, so this would be my playback graph, and I would start with a labeling on the outside. My trip permutation in this case, which we computed, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2. This is the permutation of type 2, 5, because 1 is sent to 1 plus 2, 3, 2 is sent to 2 plus 2, 4, and so on, mod n. So this is the right permutation. This is of type 2, 4, which means this is going to give me a seed in the Grassmannian 2, 5. And so this is the seed. So here, you see the quiver. This is the same quiver we've drawn before, except now the vertices are not just some solid and frozen vertices. These are now, vertices also correspond to these cluster variables, and these cluster variables are Pluka coordinates. So this P23, this is the Pluka coordinate on the columns 2 and 3, associated to this face, because this face has the label 2, 3. So the labels give you associated Plukas, which gives you the quiver. So again, the insides are the mutable vertices, the ones on the outside are frozen vertices. And this set of the face labels is actually forms a maximal weakly separated collection of 2 elements on a 5-element set. Okay, something one can check. Okay, so this is the correspondence here. Okay, questions here. Right? Oh, let me just say, okay, let me say this. Then, okay, this gives us a very good understanding of these seeds where every entry is Plucker. We do not have a good understanding, sort of combinatorial understanding of all the other seeds at all. And that's actually an open problem to figure out which other elements of the coordinate range of the Grassmannian are actually Plucker coordinates. Sorry, not Plucker, are cluster variables. So Plucker coordinates are nice sets of cluster variables, but then there are many more. And then what are they? How can we describe them? That's an open question. That's still not known. Is there some other nice combinatorics happening? And people are working in that direction. So recently there's been some little progress, but yeah, it's still widely unknown. Okay, so now I want to go back to type A story. So remember, the cluster algebra is said to be type A if the quiver Q is mutation equivalent to this very nice orientation of a type A Dynkin diagram, Coxeter diagram. Okay, and so it was very nice. So already Fomin and Zelevinsky, when they introduced cluster algebra, they made the following observation, that the coordinate ring of the Grassmannian of 2n, so this is not some arbitrary k, when k is 2, this is actually a type A cluster algebra, and you just have to subtract here 3, so some change on the indices. And in that case, so remember I told you Plucker coordinates form a nice subset of the cluster variables. This is the only case when the two are the same. So all the cluster variables are Plucker coordinates. Only in this 2n case this happens. And all the others, there are other cluster variables which are not Pluckers. And so we can see the previous theorem in a very, very nice way then. And so if you think about the notion of weak separation, it says the following. So two sets, I and j, in two-element subsets are said to be weakly separated if and only if I is of the form AB, J is of the form CD, they are all distinct, and A, B, C, D, cyclically ordered, do not cross. Okay? There is no crossing. So another way to think about this, these are I and J, you can think of this, these are non-crossing diagonals in an n-gon. If you were to label their vertices around the circle 1 through n, these would be non-crossing diagonals in an n-gon. And so the previous theorem we had on the previous slide with the three equivalences, in that case 2n has the following then description, simplification. So on this side, it's pretty much the same. You talk about reduced playback graphs of type 2n. Now on this side, it is much simpler. We don't have to say these are seeds consisting of Pluckers. These are now all the seeds. So every seed in GR2n comes from a reduced playback graph. Not just the seeds, because all the cluster variables are Pluckers. So all the seeds come from reduced playback graphs. Moreover, these maximal weakly separated collections from what we just saw just corresponds to maximal collections of non-crossing diagonals in an n-gon. Ta-da, these are the same as triangulations of polygons. Okay, that's the connection to the surface story. So maximal weak separation means maximal pairwise non-crossing, which just means triangulations. And so in our picture, this is the correspondence that we have. So this was again a 2n example. So in this case, it works. So this was the quiver from before. Now, how can you, so here in this picture, I just replaced the weakly separated collection by what should be the triangulation of the polygon. And it is very, very nice. So so this is Liz inside of a GR25. So I'm going to have a pentagon. Okay, I'm just draw it as a circle. And now each of these, I look at the mutable vertices, so these interior faces, I see it has labels 2, 4, and 1, 4. And this would mean that in my polygon, I'm going to have diagonals 2, 4, and 1, 4. So I label my vertices around the boundary clockwise of my pentagon, and I'm going to draw in diagonals 2, 4, and 1, 4. And this gives me a triangulation. And notice that what are the frozen variables? So you have these frozen variables around the boundary, 1, 2, 2, 3, 3, 4, 4, 5, 1, 5. And these are precisely the boundary segments of my polygon. So this is P2, 3. This corresponds to sort of the edge which connects 2 and 3, P2, 3. P3, 4, edge which connects 3 and 4, and so on. And then I can do the quiver. I think I used maybe the opposite orientations. Okay, I think my arrows are a bit off here. Anyways, if you were to apply this, I could get the same quiver or the opposite quiver. It's up to relabeling. No, I think, yeah, here my arrows are clockwise instead of counterclockwise. But if you were to apply the rule for getting the quiver from a triangulation, you would get the same one, okay? Except you just have to add in boundary segments. You think of boundary segments as also sort of your works in the triangulation. And now what does it mean to be frozen? Yeah, frozen means you cannot mutate. And so here frozen means these are the boundary segments. You never mutate at the boundary segments. They are always there. They're always sort of in every single cluster. You don't mutate the boundary segments, but you can mutate the inside however you like. Right? So that's the connection back to the surface picture in the type A case. And lastly, let me go through this somewhat quickly, is you can actually see snake graphs in this playback graph picture, which is really, really cool. And it goes as follows. So first we can transform G, the graph. So you start with the playback graph. You want to transform it such that boundary edges, these boundary edges are adjacent to white vertices, and G is bipartite. So bipartite means a black vertex is connected to a white vertex. So no monochromatic edges. And so in this example, you see this is a monochromatic edge, so I can contract it and make it a single edge like this. And then it would have these two, so this going back to the boundary edge, I'm going to have this edge, and this going through to this black vertex is now this curvy edge. So I did this local move, so it doesn't change the quiver, it doesn't do anything to my seed, it doesn't change the phase labels either. And also I want to say that all things adjacent to the boundary are all the white vertices. So this is a black vertex which has an edge to the boundary, and I'm just going to insert a white vertex in between. So only the white vertices are adjacent to the boundary. And again, this doesn't change the quiver or anything, because this is a vertex of degree 2, and these we can remove freely by local moves. So that's okay. And now there's something called a matching of the playback graph, which is kind of the same we saw before, but slightly different. So in a matching, in this case, we only require that all the interior vertices are covered by elements of the matching. So in this blue here, this is a matching. And so my interior, my colored vertices are all part of the matching. They are all matched. But sort of, I don't care about matching all the boundary vertices. So this vertex 4 is not really matched. This vertex 5 and 1 are not matched. So my boundary of M, this is the collection of boundary edges of the matching M. So in blue is my matching M. And if I look at the boundary, this corresponds to, I just see the vertices 2 and 3. So the boundary of my matching M is 2, 3. And then what follows is one can actually compute cluster variables, nice cluster variables, the Plucker cluster variables, by looking at the matchings of G, playback graph, with some weights on the edges. And so there's some formula, again, we're not going to go through it, but there's some in our example. If you want to compute the Plucker P sub AB, you want to look at the matchings M, whose boundary is, okay, there's a shift here, A minus 1, B minus 1. And some weights of this matching. Okay, the weight is defined somehow differently. And okay, so let me say that the way I wrote here is somewhat special. This works in the case when K is 2. It's slightly more general when, a bit more general when K is not 2. But if we are in this 2 case, then we also had this matching formula in terms of the expansion formula in terms of snake graphs. And the idea is as follows. If you look at this playback graph, and you want to look at you want to understand, let's say, the variable 3, 5, then you want to look at matchings which have boundary edges 2 and 4, so 2 and 4. And if you think about what are all the matchings, so I have to match this, and I have to match this, and I have some freedom how I can match the inside such that none of the interior, none of these other ones going to the boundary are matched. And if you go through the combinatorics, you see that this is the same as perfect matchings of this, just the inside graph. Okay, it's not so hard to see. So you match this, you match this. You don't want to match any of these boundaries, which means you really just have to find the matching of this thing. And this thing, if you just redraw it, is the same as this playback graph, as this snake graph. Okay, so matchings here as like the matchings of the snake graph. And if you were to transform this into the surface picture, it would correspond to the cluster variable associated to this arc gamma, which is 3, 5, which crosses 2 arcs, so it's going to have 2 tiles. Okay, so in this case, we see this again. We see snake graphs inside of playback graphs, again, only in the case when k is 2 as well. So that's this nice connection to the surface story. All right, and I'm going to stop here and thank you very much and ask for more questions.